The fastest way to discover who people really are is to give them a microphone and an audience. I never imagined I would learn that lesson at my own daughter's wedding. My name is Michael Carter. I'm 64 years old, and until that afternoon, I believe there was no greater joy than watching your only child begin a new chapter of her life. I had polished my 15-year-old black suit the night before. It wasn't fashionable anymore, but it was clean, neatly pressed, and it was the same suit I had worn when Emily graduated from college. I looked at myself in the motel mirror that morning and told myself none of that mattered. Weddings weren't about fathers. They were about daughters. Emily deserved the happiest day of her life, and if blending quietly into the background helped make that happen, I was willing to do exactly that. The country club was more elegant than any place I had ever been. Fresh white roses lined the walkway. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across the ballroom, and every table looked like something from a magazine. Expensive cars filled the parking lot, and guests stepped out wearing designer clothes that probably cost more than everything inside my closet combined. I took a slow breath before walking in, carrying the small gift I had wrapped myself. It wasn't expensive. It was a leather-bound journal with a handwritten letter tucked inside. I wanted my daughter to have something that money couldn't buy. For a few beautiful minutes, everything felt perfect. Emily looked radiant in her wedding dress. When she smiled across the room, I remembered the little girl who used to run into my arms after school with scraped knees and impossible dreams. I smiled back, hoping she knew how proud I was. Then Jason Brooks picked up the microphone. At first, everyone laughed at his jokes. He thanked friends, praised his parents, and complimented the wedding planner. The room was relaxed. Glasses clinked. Cameras flashed. Then his eyes found me. A grin spread across his face, the kind that looked charming until you realized someone else was about to pay the price. "Let's give a special thank you," he said, "to Michael, my new father-in-law. He's had plenty of free time lately since unemployment apparently comes with unlimited vacation days." A few scattered laughs echoed across the room. My fingers tightened around the gift box, but I stayed silent. Jason wasn't finished. "I guess somebody had to prove you don't need a career to attend a luxury wedding. Thanks for making it anyway." This time the laughter was louder. People glanced toward me with awkward smiles, unsure whether they should laugh or look away. I felt dozens of eyes settle on my face at once. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing. Funny how humiliation can become strangely quiet after enough years of swallowing disappointment. I looked toward Emily. She forced a nervous smile, then quickly looked down at her bouquet. She didn't say a word. That silence hurt far more than Jason's joke ever could. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to walk out before anyone noticed the old man standing alone beside the back wall. Instead, I simply nodded once, pretending none of it mattered. Inside, though, something cracked. Jason raised his champagne glass as if he had just delivered the speech of the year. More laughter followed. The band waited politely for him to finish. Around me, conversations resumed as though nothing unusual had happened. Maybe to everyone else, it really hadn't. Maybe I was just another older man who had failed in life. Another unemployed father who should feel lucky he had even received an invitation. They didn't know my story. They didn't know what had happened during the years before this wedding. They didn't know what I had given up or why I had never defended myself. And they certainly didn't know that before this day was over, the room would learn something that no amount of money, status, or polished speeches could erase. I lowered my eyes to the small leather journal in my hands because it was easier than looking at the faces around me. The room quickly returned to cheerful conversation, but I could still hear Jason's words repeating inside my head. Unemployed loser. Funny how a few careless words could erase decades of sacrifices in the minds of strangers. They saw an older man standing alone in an outdated suit. They did not see the years behind the wrinkles or the choices that had shaped every line on my face. Losing my job had never been part of the plan. For nearly 35 years, I had worked for the same manufacturing company outside Columbus, Ohio. I arrived before sunrise almost every morning and rarely missed a day, even during snowstorms. I believed loyalty still meant something. Then one Friday afternoon, the company announced another round of restructuring. They thanked us for our dedication, handed us envelopes, and assured us that the decision was purely financial. Just like that, my career was over. At 60 years old, finding another full-time position was far more difficult than I had imagined. Every interview ended politely. Every rejection sounded almost identical. They admired my experience but wanted someone younger, someone who would stay longer, someone who fit their new direction. I never blamed anyone. Businesses made business decisions. That was life. What hurt was watching the confidence I had built over decades slowly disappear with every unanswered application. During those months, I made one promise to myself. Emily would never carry my burden. She had just started building her own career, and I wanted her focused on her future instead of worrying about mine. Whenever she called, I smiled before answering the phone, even if I had spent the morning calculating how to stretch my savings another month. I told her everything was fine because fathers are supposed to make their children feel safe, even when they are quietly falling apart. After her mother passed away 8 years earlier, that promise became even more important. Emily had already lost one parent. I refused to let her lose her sense of security too. So I sold my fishing boat before anyone noticed I no longer used it. Then I sold the classic pickup truck I had spent years restoring in my garage. I downsized from the family house into a modest one-bedroom apartment and filled the empty shelves with photographs instead of expensive decorations. Every decision bought me a little more time. Every sacrifice remained invisible because I wanted it that way. Emily never asked many questions about my finances, and I never volunteered the answers. She believed I was simply enjoying early retirement after decades of hard work. I let her believe it because watching her smile was worth more than preserving my pride. Then Jason entered her life. At first, I genuinely liked him. He was confident, ambitious, and successful in ways that reminded me of the determination I once had. He spoke about investments, promotions, and expensive vacations with effortless confidence. I thought he would take good care of my daughter. Slowly, though, I noticed something else. He measured people by job titles, neighborhoods, and bank accounts. Every conversation somehow circled back to money or status. If someone drove an older car, Jason assumed they lacked ambition. If someone worked an ordinary job, he treated them as though they had settled for less. I told myself I was imagining it because Emily seemed happy. I wanted to believe love would soften those sharp edges. Instead, those edges became sharper every year. The fewer details I shared about my own situation, the more Jason filled the silence with his own assumptions. To him, unemployment meant failure. Simplicity meant weakness. Quiet dignity looked exactly like defeat. I could have corrected him 100 times before the wedding, but I always chose silence because I believed actions mattered more than arguments. Standing in that ballroom, however, I began to wonder whether silence had protected my daughter from worry or had simply allowed someone else to write a completely false story about the man I really was. Jason stepped away from the microphone with the confidence of a man who believed he had just entertained the room. Guests lifted their champagne glasses again. Conversations restarted, and servers continued placing elegant dinners in front of smiling families, as though nothing unusual had happened. I remained standing near the back wall, still holding the gift I had wrapped for Emily. It suddenly felt heavier than it had an hour earlier. I considered leaving quietly before anyone noticed. After all, weddings were meant to celebrate love, not expose old men to public embarrassment. Then I heard someone behind me whisper, "That joke was a little harsh." Another voice answered almost immediately, "Maybe, but there is usually some truth behind those things." I did not turn around. There was no point. Once people accepted a story, they rarely questioned it. Jason had given them an easy one. Successful young businessman, unemployed father, winner and loser. Life rarely fit into such simple categories, but simple stories were comfortable. Emily finally walked toward me during the dinner service. Her smile looked forced, and she kept glancing across the ballroom to make sure Jason was not watching. "Dad," she said softly, "please do not take what he said personally. He was only trying to make everyone laugh." I looked into her eyes, searching for the little girl who used to defend me whenever someone spoke unfairly. She was still there somewhere, but adulthood had buried her beneath years of compromise. I smiled gently because I refused to make her choose between her father and her husband on her wedding day. "I am all right," I answered. "Today is about you." She nodded with visible relief, hugged me briefly, and hurried back toward the head table before we could say anything more meaningful. That short conversation stayed with me longer than Jason's speech. Emily had not agreed with him, but she had not challenged him either. Silence had become contagious. A few minutes later, Jason approached my table carrying another drink. His expression remained friendly enough for anyone watching from a distance, but his words landed with practiced precision. "I hope you are not upset," he said. "You know how wedding speeches go? People expect humor." I nodded once. "I understand." He smiled. "Good. I would hate for anyone to think there was tension in the family." Then he leaned slightly closer. "By the way, some of my business partners are here tonight. I would appreciate it if you avoided discussing your employment situation with them. First impressions matter." He walked away before I could respond. I watched him greet another group of guests, shaking hands with effortless confidence. To everyone else, he looked charming. To me, he looked frightened. People who constantly reminded others of their own success were usually protecting something fragile inside themselves. Still, I kept that thought to myself. Across the ballroom, I noticed several members of Jason's family watching me with polite curiosity. One older gentleman asked another guest something while glancing in my direction. A woman quietly shook her head before both of them returned to their meals. Their expressions were not cruel. They simply believed what they had been told. I could hardly blame them. I had spent years hiding my struggles so carefully that even my own daughter knew only a fraction of the truth. My silence had become the foundation upon which Jason built his assumptions. As the evening continued, stories about career achievements, promotions, investment properties, and luxury vacations filled every nearby conversation. I listened without envy. I had once believed those things defined success as well. Age had taught me something different. Character revealed itself not during moments of comfort, but during moments when another person's dignity rested in your hands. That evening, Jason had been handed that responsibility, and without hesitation, he had traded my dignity for a few easy laughs. I quietly placed my wrapped journal beneath my chair and looked toward the ballroom entrance. For the first time all day, I found myself wondering whether staying until the end was truly the right thing to do. After several quiet minutes, I made my decision. I picked up the leather journal from beneath my chair, straightened my jacket, and headed toward the ballroom entrance. I did not want my daughter to remember her wedding day as the afternoon her father argued with her husband. Walking away felt like the last gift I could still give her. The music shifted into a slower melody as couples gathered near the dance floor. Laughter filled the room once again, and for a brief moment I almost reached the exit unnoticed. Then I heard Emily call my name. I stopped and turned around. She hurried across the room, lifting the edge of her wedding dress just enough to keep from stepping on it. There was concern in her eyes now, stronger than before. "Dad, where are you going?" she asked. I forced another reassuring smile. "It has been a long day. I thought I would head home early and let you enjoy the rest of your evening." She looked disappointed. "But you have barely stayed for dinner." Before I could answer, Jason joined us with two members of his family standing only a few feet behind him. His expression remained pleasant, but there was an unmistakable confidence in the way he folded his arms. "Michael probably has other places to be," he said with a light chuckle. "Besides, receptions can be uncomfortable if you do not know many people." His father laughed politely. One of his cousins smiled without saying anything. No one challenged the remark. Emily looked from Jason to me, clearly sensing the tension but struggling to decide how to respond. "Dad," she said quietly, "are you sure everything is all right?" I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to explain that respect mattered more than expensive decorations, that no amount of luxury could replace kindness, and that I would gladly trade every elegant centerpiece in the ballroom for one sincere moment where my daughter stood beside me without hesitation. Instead, I simply nodded. "Everything is fine." Jason rested a hand gently on Emily's shoulder. "See? I told you he was fine." His voice remained calm enough that anyone nearby would have thought he was trying to help. Yet every sentence seemed carefully designed to end the conversation before Emily could ask another question. She hesitated for another second before one of her bridesmaids called her back toward the dance floor. Emily looked at me one last time, gave me a small apologetic smile, and walked away. I watched her disappear into the crowd, wondering whether she had noticed how many opportunities she had just allowed to slip away. I turned back toward the exit. The evening air waiting outside suddenly seemed far more welcoming than the ballroom behind me. My hand had just reached the polished brass door handle when the master of ceremonies spoke into the microphone again. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we continue with dessert, we have one more distinguished guest who has just arrived. He was delayed by a flight cancellation but insisted on making it here tonight. Most of the guests casually turned toward the entrance without much interest. Jason glanced over his shoulder with a polite smile, probably expecting another business associate or distant relative. I stepped aside as the front doors slowly opened. An older gentleman wearing a tailored navy suit entered the ballroom with calm confidence. His silver hair was neatly combed, and although he was probably in his early 70s, he carried himself with remarkable energy. The wedding coordinator hurried over to greet him personally, clearly recognizing him the moment he arrived. I stared at the man for several seconds before recognition settled in. I had not seen him in almost 6 years, yet I knew that face immediately. My pulse quickened for the first time all evening. Of all the people who could have walked through those doors, he was the one person who knew the complete truth about my past, the choices I had made, and the sacrifices I had never shared with anyone, including my own daughter. The room gradually quieted as the distinguished guest made his way through the ballroom. Conversations faded into polite whispers. Even the musicians paused for a moment, sensing that someone important had arrived. I remained standing near the entrance, my hand still resting on the door handle. For a second, I wondered if he would recognize me after so many years. Then our eyes met. His expression immediately softened into a warm smile that I had not seen in a very long time. Without hesitation, he changed direction and walked straight toward me instead of the bride and groom. The puzzled looks around the room appeared almost instantly. Jason noticed it as well. I could see the confidence slowly fade from his face as he watched the older gentleman extend both hands toward me. "Michael," he said with genuine warmth. "It has been far too long." I smiled for the first time that entire afternoon. "Good to see you again, Richard." Richard Bennett shook my hand firmly before placing a hand on my shoulder. "I cannot believe you are trying to leave before I even have the chance to thank you properly." Several guests exchanged confused glances. Jason looked toward one of his business partners, as if silently asking whether they knew each other. They simply shrugged. Emily also stared in our direction, clearly surprised that someone who had just received such an enthusiastic welcome from the wedding staff seemed more interested in speaking with her father than anyone else. Richard turned slightly toward the crowd and laughed gently. "You always did have a habit of disappearing before anyone could recognize what you had done." I quietly answered, "Some things are better left in the past." He looked directly at me for a moment before replying, "Perhaps, but not everything deserves to stay hidden forever." Those words settled over the nearby guests like an unexpected breeze. Jason stepped forward with the polished confidence that had carried him throughout the evening. "Mr. Bennett," he said, extending his hand, "I am Jason Brooks. Thank you for coming. It is an honor to have you here." Richard politely shook his hand, but quickly looked back toward me. "Congratulations on your wedding," he said. "You have a beautiful celebration." Jason smiled. "Thank you. I actually know several people who have mentioned your company over the years." Richard nodded courteously without expanding the conversation. Instead, he asked me, "Michael, have you been keeping well?" "As well as anyone can," I answered. "Retirement has been quieter than I expected." Richard smiled knowingly. "You always were too modest." Jason laughed lightly, assuming it was harmless conversation. "Michael does not like talking about himself very much." Richard glanced at Jason with calm curiosity. "No, he never has. In fact, that has always been one of his greatest strengths." Jason folded his arms. "I suppose humility is a good quality." Richard's expression became thoughtful. "Humility is admirable, but allowing other people to misunderstand your character can sometimes come at a very high price." An uncomfortable silence followed. Emily slowly walked closer, standing beside me now instead of across the room. "Dad," she asked quietly, "how do you know Mr. Bennett?" Before I could answer, Richard looked at her with a gentle smile. "You must be Emily. Your father used to keep a photograph of you on his desk every single day." Emily blinked in surprise. "My father's desk?" Richard nodded. "Yes. There was never a meeting where he did not find an excuse to mention how proud he was of his daughter." Emily looked at me with confusion growing in her eyes because she had believed I had spent my final working years as nothing more than an ordinary employee waiting for retirement. Richard continued speaking with complete sincerity. "Your father never talked about himself, but he spoke about you constantly." Around us, more guests quietly drifted closer, pretending to refill drinks or adjust chairs while listening. Jason remained silent now, watching every word with increasing uncertainty. He had expected this unexpected guest to reinforce the image he had created all evening. Instead, every sentence seemed to reveal that there was an entirely different story standing quietly behind the man he had dismissed as someone who had accomplished nothing. Emily looked from Richard to me, searching both of our faces for an explanation that would make sense of everything she thought she knew. Around us, conversations had completely stopped. Even the servers stood quietly beside their carts, unsure whether to continue working or wait for whatever was about to unfold. I wished none of this had happened at her wedding, but I also knew I could not ask Richard to pretend we were strangers. He had never been the kind of man who ignored the truth simply because it was inconvenient. Richard smiled gently at Emily before speaking again. "Your father would probably prefer that I remain quiet," he said. "That has always been his way, but I have spent too many years watching him receive far too little credit." I quietly interrupted. "Richard, today is not about me." He turned toward me with a look of sincere respect. "No, Michael. Today is about family. That is exactly why the truth belongs here." Jason forced a polite smile, although I could see uncertainty replacing the confidence that had carried him all afternoon. "I am afraid I am missing part of the story," he said. Richard nodded. "That makes two of us." I spent years trying to convince Michael that people deserved to know what he had done, but he never wanted recognition. Emily spoke softly. "What exactly did my father do?" Richard took a slow breath before answering. 6 years ago, our company faced the worst financial crisis in its history. We were weeks away from shutting down one of our largest facilities. Hundreds of employees would have lost their jobs. Investors were demanding immediate cuts. The board wanted to protect profits. Your father refused to let ordinary families pay the price. Emily frowned in confusion. "Dad never told me any of that." "Of course he did not," Richard replied. "Because he believed leadership meant carrying burdens, not advertising them." I lowered my eyes. Those months had been among the hardest of my career, but I had never viewed them as something worthy of praise. Richard continued. "Michael proposed a restructuring plan that protected as many employees as possible. It required eliminating his own executive position first. The board accepted the proposal because his resignation reduced costs immediately and gave the company enough time to recover. He knew exactly what would happen to his own future before he presented the idea." A wave of quiet whispers moved through the ballroom. Emily stared at me in disbelief. "Executive position?" she repeated. "You told me you worked in operations." I smiled sadly. Operations was easier to explain. Richard gently shook his head. "Your father was the senior vice president of operations. He spent decades earning that position, and he walked away from it voluntarily because he believed protecting hundreds of families mattered more than protecting his title." Jason's expression changed completely. He looked at me, then back at Richard, as though hoping he had misunderstood. "That cannot be right," he said. "If that were true, why would he be unemployed afterward?" Richard answered calmly. "Because executives in their 60s are not always welcomed by companies searching for younger leadership. Michael received consulting offers, but none would have allowed him to continue supporting the people who depended on him in the way he believed they deserved. He chose dignity over desperation." Emily slowly covered her mouth with one hand. Tears began forming in her eyes. "Dad, why did you never tell me?" I looked at my daughter with the same quiet love I had carried for her since the day she was born. "Because I wanted you to build your life without feeling responsible for mine. I never wanted my sacrifices to become your burden." The silence that followed felt entirely different from the silence earlier that afternoon. Before, people had looked at me with pity. Now they looked at me with respect, and perhaps even regret. Jason remained motionless, unable to reconcile the image he had created with the man now standing before him. The simple story he had believed for years was beginning to collapse under the weight of a truth that had never needed to shout in order to exist. The silence lingered for several long seconds before anyone found the courage to speak. The first voice did not come from Emily or Jason. It came from one of Jason's business partners standing near the head table. "Wait," he said, looking directly at Richard. "Are you saying Michael Carter was the executive who gave up his own position during the restructuring at Bennett Industrial?" Richard answered without hesitation. "Yes, every word of it." The man slowly shook his head in disbelief. "I read about that case years ago. Most people assumed the executive retired with a generous package." Richard smiled faintly. Michael could have accepted a much larger financial agreement. Instead, he negotiated additional severance protection for employees who had spent decades building the company. He believed they deserved security more than he did. A ripple of astonishment spread across the room. Several guests who had laughed earlier now lowered their eyes, suddenly uncomfortable with the memory of their own reactions. Jason remained frozen, his face losing more color with every passing moment. Emily looked at me with tears she was no longer trying to hide. "Dad," she whispered, "is everything he said true?" I nodded gently. "Most of it. Richard always makes me sound better than I really am." Richard chuckled softly. "That is exactly the kind of answer I expected." Emily stepped closer. "Why would you hide something like that from me?" I took a slow breath. "Because I never wanted your respect to depend on my job title. I wanted you to love me because I was your father, not because I once held an impressive position." She looked down at the floor for a moment before lifting her eyes again. "Instead, I let someone make you feel small while I stood there saying nothing." Her voice trembled with regret. I gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You were trying to protect your wedding day. I understand that." She shook her head. "No, I was protecting my comfort. There is a difference." Those words carried across the ballroom with surprising clarity. Several guests quietly nodded. Jason finally found his voice. "Emily, I did not know any of this." She slowly turned toward him. "You never asked." He looked stunned. "I assumed." She interrupted him before he could finish. "Exactly. You assumed." For the first time since I had met Jason, I saw genuine uncertainty replace his confidence. He searched the room as though hoping someone would rescue him from the consequences of his own words, but no one came forward. Even members of his own family looked thoughtful rather than supportive. His father quietly cleared his throat before speaking. "Son, perhaps we judged too quickly." Jason looked at him in disbelief. "Dad," his father continued calmly, "character is not measured by a paycheck." Those simple words carried more weight than any speech delivered that afternoon. Richard glanced around the ballroom before addressing everyone nearby. "I have worked with thousands of professionals over 4 decades. I have met people with extraordinary talent and impressive titles. Very few possessed Michael's integrity. That cannot be listed on a resume, but it is the quality that people remember long after promotions and salaries are forgotten." No one laughed now. The ballroom that had echoed with jokes earlier had become a room filled with quiet reflection. I wished the evening had never taken this turn, yet I also recognized something important. Sometimes the truth did not arrive to embarrass people. Sometimes it arrived to give them the opportunity to become better than they had been only moments before. Emily reached for my hand, something she had not done in years. Her fingers tightened gently around mine, as though she were trying to hold onto time itself. Across from us, Jason stood completely alone, surrounded by guests, yet separated from them by the uncomfortable realization that every careless word he had spoken earlier had been built upon assumptions instead of understanding, and those assumptions had now collapsed in front of everyone who mattered most to him. Jason remained standing near the head table, his hands now resting awkwardly at his sides, as the room continued to watch him in silence. The confidence that had carried him earlier in the evening had completely disappeared, replaced by a discomfort he could no longer hide behind charm or humor. Emily still held my hand, but her attention slowly shifted toward him. I could feel the weight of her thoughts in the way her fingers tightened slightly, as if she was trying to understand a version of her husband she had never seen before. Jason finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. "Emily, I did not mean for any of this to happen. I did not know your father was involved in something like that." Emily did not respond immediately. When she did, her voice was steady but no longer soft. "That is the problem, Jason. You never knew because you never cared to know." A few guests looked down at their plates, pretending not to listen, but no one left. The ballroom felt suspended in a moment that no one wanted to interrupt. Jason took a small step forward. "I was trying to make people laugh. It was just a joke." Emily shook her head slowly. It was not a joke to him. It was a judgment. I gently squeezed her hand, but she did not let go. It felt like she needed that connection more than I did. Jason turned toward me. "Michael, I am sorry if I crossed a line." I met his gaze calmly. A line was crossed, yes. But not only today. It has been crossed in small ways for a long time without anyone noticing. My words were not angry, only honest. That seemed to affect him more than any accusation could have. Jason looked around the room as if searching for support, but even his closest friends avoided his eyes. One of his colleagues cleared his throat. Jason, maybe you should sit down. Jason ignored him. Instead, he turned back to Emily. You are really going to believe this over everything we have built together? Emily hesitated for a moment, and I could see the emotional struggle in her face. Then she answered clearly. I am not choosing between you and him. I am realizing I never should have been asked to. That statement landed heavily in the space between them. Jason looked stunned, as though the ground beneath him had shifted. Richard stepped slightly closer, his tone calm but firm. Son, respect is not something you earn once and keep forever. It is something you maintain through every interaction. Tonight, you lost it not because of one comment, but because of a pattern of assumptions that were never questioned. Jason lowered his head slightly, the weight of those words settling in. For the first time, he did not have a quick response. Emily finally released my hand and stepped forward toward Jason. I thought she might soften, but instead she spoke with quiet clarity. I love you, Jason, but I cannot ignore what I saw tonight. You humiliated my father in front of everyone without understanding who he is. And when you were given the chance to correct it, you doubled down instead of listening. Jason opened his mouth but closed it again. There was nothing left to defend. Emily continued, her voice steady. I need time to understand what this means for us. Because right now, I feel like I married someone who sees people as labels instead of human beings. The room grew even quieter, if that was possible. Jason nodded slowly, though it was unclear whether he truly understood or was simply accepting that there was nothing else he could say. I understand, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Emily stepped back beside me again, and for the first time since the beginning of the evening, she looked fully present beside her father rather than divided between two worlds. Jason stood alone now in the center of a celebration that no longer felt like his. Guests avoided staring, but no one pretended not to notice anymore. The laughter from earlier in the evening felt like it belonged to a completely different lifetime. What remained was a quiet awareness that every word spoken in confidence could eventually be measured against truth, and truth, once revealed, did not require permission to change everything. The music resumed slowly after a long silence, though it no longer carried the same energy it had earlier in the evening. Conversations attempted to restart in scattered corners of the ballroom, but they lacked the ease and laughter from before. People were no longer focused on celebration. They were focused on what they had just learned and what it revealed about the assumptions they had made. Emily stood beside me, still holding onto my arm, but her presence felt different now. It was not hesitation anymore. It was clarity. Jason remained near the head table for a few moments longer, as if waiting for something to reset the night back to how it used to be, but nothing changed. Eventually, he stepped back slightly, his posture less rigid, his expression no longer trying to perform confidence. One of his friends approached him quietly and spoke a few words I could not hear. Jason nodded once, then looked toward Emily. She did not move. She did not signal him to come closer. She simply watched him, as if understanding had replaced confusion but not yet replaced emotion. Richard stood beside me now, his hands folded in front of him. He will recover from this, he said quietly, but he will not forget it. I nodded. Maybe he needed to hear it. Richard looked at me with a faint smile. You have always said that about people who hurt you. You give them more grace than they expect. I did not respond immediately. Grace had never felt like a choice. It had simply been the way I survived years of misunderstanding. Emily finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. Dad, I think I understand you better now than I ever have before. I turned toward her. You did not need tonight for that. She shook her head. Maybe I did. I needed to see what happens when people assume they know someone without asking. I looked at her for a long moment. I never wanted you to learn it this way. She gave a small, emotional smile. I am glad I did, because now I will not forget it. Across the room, Jason slowly approached once more. This time there was no confidence in his steps, only careful uncertainty. He stopped a few feet away, keeping a respectful distance. Emily, he said quietly. She looked at him, but did not answer immediately. He continued, I am going to leave soon. I just wanted to say I understand if you need time. I understand if tonight changed things. His voice was no longer defensive. It was controlled, but stripped of pride. Emily studied him for a moment, then nodded slightly. I do need time, she said. And I need honesty from now on, not assumptions. Jason nodded. I understand. There was no argument left in him. He looked at me briefly, then back at Emily. I am sorry, Michael, he said again. This time there was no attempt to justify it. I answered simply, I hope you take what you learned tonight seriously. He nodded once and stepped back, then turned and walked away from the head table. No one stopped him. No one called him back. As he moved through the ballroom, guests parted quietly, allowing him to pass without comment. The celebration slowly returned in fragments, but something fundamental had shifted. It was no longer just a wedding. It had become a reminder of how quickly perception could change when truth finally entered a room that had been built on assumptions. Emily leaned her head gently against my shoulder for a brief moment. I am sorry I did not defend you sooner, she said. I placed my hand over hers. You do not need to defend me. You just need to know me. She nodded softly. I do now. I looked out across the ballroom, where life continued in softer tones and quieter conversations. For the first time in many years, I felt something I had not expected to feel at a wedding. Not pride, not sadness, but a calm sense of release. Not because everything had been perfect, but because the truth had finally been seen without needing to shout, and sometimes that was enough to change the way people remembered everything that came before it.